welcome to this exciting panel to discuss a topic I think is on everybody's minds these days, and that is how exactly are we going to get back to school and do it safely and do it effectively for our kids. We're here to discuss this struggle that schools are going through, making decisions how to reopen during this incredible pandemic. And we have some great panelists to discuss that. I'm Clark Dean, with Transwestern. I am co-chair of the Global Health Crisis Coordination Center, which was stood up at the beginning of this year to help coordinate enterprise capability, emerging technologies, and public health expertise to make an impact during public health crises. So we were stood up at the request of the CDC Foundation and have been serving in that capacity. We've been doing a lot of thinking about how to reopen schools, but I am thrilled to be joined today on this panel by two leading experts in both education and health, Meria Carstarphen and Dr. Sandra Ford. So, and we'd like to thank the Meria Group for being the sponsor to make all of this possible today. So Meria, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, good morning. My name is Meria Carstarphen. I am a career superintendent. I have worked in urban settings my entire career. Those are mostly capital cities where large numbers of children who live in poverty, have special needs, language needs, Black and brown children overwhelmingly make up the student demographics of the districts where I have worked. I've been through several health crises in my career, spanning now over 20 plus years. And this one is, of course, incredibly different. And there are a lot of things that I know parents have on their minds, certainly educators who will be going back on the front lines. And I'm here today to give an education perspective as it relates to supporting children and families who have school-age kids, particularly in public schools, that may need some guidance and hear a little different message, if you will, about how at least I see it from my perspective as a career superintendent, but certainly someone who's focused in public education. Thank you for having me. Thanks,
Meria. And Dr. Ford.
I am the District Health Director for DeKalb County, Georgia. A position I've held for 15 years. In between that time, I was also the interim state health officer for Georgia. So I've had positions in public health at both the state and local level. I was also the deputy state health officer in Florida. As a board certified pediatrician, this current situation with schools has me very concerned, and I'm happy to be here today to talk about some of the things we need to be thinking about, both from a medical perspective as well as from the academic side of this. I also have a college-age son, so I'm feeling this directly and trying to make some decisions in our own household about how we're going to move forward. But it's a tough situation to be in, and there's so many things to think about. And my job today is really just to speak about the health perspective of this and some of the ways that if we're going to move forward, we can try to keep as many people safe as possible.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. Ford. And it almost seems crazy to have either one of you introduce yourself, because anybody in the state of Georgia or the city of Atlanta who doesn't know you has clearly been under a rock somewhere. So thank you both for your leadership in our city and our state. Because it's so important to have that kind of leadership, especially right now during a crisis like this. So let's jump right into some of the questions that people are wrestling with. The first is schools obviously have had to make decisions. I've got two college-age kids and a high school child myself, and all the schools are handling this completely differently. So the first question I guess is Meria. I think a lot of school districts are really struggling with what do they do? Yeah, how do they open? If they do open, how do they do it? I'd love to get your thoughts on what are they doing right? What are they doing wrong? And what might we be doing differently to help the kids get back to school, but also do it in a safe and effective way?
Yeah, in my most recent position as the superintendent of the capital city here in Georgia, that's Atlanta, there were a couple of things that we had to look at. And I think, we are we were in a position where you could actually do more to stop the spread of the virus. And I feel like right now, as I see things, we're kind of back to where we were in March. It feels like we've sort of come full circle. So I'm going to work on the perspective that, not that I agree, but that there are schools that will be going back to school full-time, in person, or some version of that. And that, to me, kind of flies in the face of what we were trying to stop at the outset back in March by getting in front of the issue before we were kind of in this spot. So some of the things I think schools are getting right is the concept of virtual learning, taking the time to do things like give choice to parents, and hearing more from parents who have children who are not falling neatly in the general ed space. Again, special needs or language learning or early childhood. So there are certain groups of kids who probably need more support and some version of direct support compared to kids who might be able to have access to virtual learning and be okay. So I think being in the space of virtual and offering families some choice is sort of getting it right, if you will. The other part, I think, is any school or program that is going back to school in person on any level, the things that they must do is around mask mandating or making sure their hygiene stations, their social distancing, frequent disinfecting of classrooms and spaces where kids are. I think those are things that make me more comfortable when people are following the science and the guidelines around that science. I think those districts and schools that are getting it not as right would be the ones that are not respecting the science. And I think that Dr. Ford, much like me, has seen, like everyone else, kids with no mask, crowded hallway spaces, no social distancing. And that to me just screams that we are not being responsible enough in this crisis. So getting it right means that you're going to have to be disciplined. And with no discipline, I think we can expect the virus to spread.
And I think that has been one of the big challenges, right? Is discipline in a time. And obviously, as a former superintendent, discipline, and discipline can be hard. But it's one of those things that we sort of have to do. Dr. Ford, what do you think about this as far as how schools have been responding? What do you think they're getting right and wrong from a public health perspective?
So I completely agree with Dr. Carstarphen. I think that the decision about whether or not to open up the schools is obviously an individual decision based on the different superintendents, different school boards, and the will of the parents in some instances. But if that is a choice, it's going to have to be done meticulously. And I think that the discipline piece goes back to, this can't be a decision about if you feel like wearing a mask, you can wear a mask. This has to be like the dress code. If you can't come to school in spaghetti straps, then you should not be able to come to school without a mask on. And you should be sent home if you don't wear it, because it's not just about you. It's about your classmates. It's about the teachers. It's about the cafeteria staff. And I think that any successful school year is going to have that level of discipline, because otherwise what we're going to see is what we're seeing now, where there's so many kids infected that you're going to have to keep shutting school and opening school and shutting school and opening school. And that's not going to be a positive educational experience either. And so if the goal is to make sure our children are educated, you have to keep them safe at the same time.
I completely agree. And it's funny that you bring this up, because it struck me that as people talk about discipline and the fact that, it seems like some schools we're hearing say, well, we can't control people's preference or choice. I went to a public school in Alabama, and let me tell you, we had a rule that we had to tuck our shirts in. And they were pretty good at enforcing that rule. If you didn't tuck your shirt in, you got called in. So it just seems like the infrastructure and tools to be able to enforce these things. It's probably just the will to do it that might need to be a bit stronger in a certain sense. So Dr. Ford, speaking of that kind of, I think sort of the will to do it is is probably driven by people's understanding of the infectious spread of disease, right? And it seems like there's a lot of misinformation out there right now. You know, it was reported recently that 97,000 children in America have tested positive for COVID-19 in just the past 2 weeks. So what can you tell us about the cases of COVID-19 that are appearing, this kind of spike in appearance, or it seems like a spike since many schools, she was saying, is that we are seeing, you know, at first we really focused on the elderly population, the at-risk people. But what we're seeing now is that there is actually, you know, that young people can get it and can spread it. While certainly not a lot of them are getting, you know, are necessarily dying from the disease, there are definitely complications that a lot of young people are seeing. And we're seeing a lot of evidence to suggest that young people can absolutely spread the disease in a way that can be very dangerous to others. And so it's not just a matter of, you know, the people that get infected actually having those medical complications and potentially fatal ones, but who might also get that as they go back to their homes, or spread it around to others who may be in a situation where, you know, they are vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the medical doctor, but, you know, I have to read the research, and was making life and death decisions for staff and students toward the end of the school year, like everyone else who was leading a school district in America. And I think that part of the original thoughts about, you know, how this was spreading was just tied to the science. People didn't know much about the virus. And so it was hit or miss throughout that whole process. But, you know, Monday morning quarterbacking or 2020 hindsight, however you want to look at it, I think that the low spread among the kids part, again, I'm not a scientist, but I think I've got a pretty good head on my shoulder, was tied to the fact that many of we started shutting down schools. We sent them home. We did not, at least in Atlanta public schools, we didn't have a single case, even though we closed school. And I thought that was a smart way to get in front of the virus spread. And there were different phases you could go through. But what I think I see, or what we're seeing, is that it's not because they're less likely to spread the virus, but it's because they've largely been home and not in those assembly-like, classroom-like, stuffed hallway-like, on the football field, in stadiums. I mean, you name anything we do with kids, cafeterias, you know, any kind of social event for our students involved a lot of students at the same time. So you know, a lot of children were sent home. It didn't mean they weren't vulnerable to the virus. They just haven't been out in the transmitting part as much as they would be if they were brought back to school. And so I think that that's something we have to really think about as we were bringing kids and all the educators back into the fold. You're gonna naturally see more transmission, and I think that that's a pretty common sense approach, while also keeping an eye on science.
I wanted to tag on to what Dr. Carstarphen was saying. You know, it's not so much the children also. I think that we need to understand how this virus is spread, because you have a child who may have a relatively mild course, because thank goodness our children really do have amazing immune systems for the most part. But if you live in a household with other folks who may be, you know, a little more vulnerable, you picking that COVID up from your classmate and bringing it into your home could be deadly. You know, we had a horrible case here of a family that all three contracted COVID-19 and only the child survived. And so now a family is destroyed. And this is not going to be an isolated event. You know, I'm concerned about families. I'm concerned about staff and faculty, bus drivers, cafeteria folk who may not have that amazing, you know, juvenile immune system, who are now being exposed constantly. And if we're not meticulous about wearing masks, we're putting whole communities in danger.
And I know we haven't said this yet, but Clark, one of the things about, you know, being a 3-time urban superintendent is that you see a lot of children, Black, brown, poor, who are often already disenfranchised from the school process. And a lot of our caregivers, the very people who are taking care of children, are the ones who are most vulnerable to the disease. They're over 60, they have pre-existing conditions, they're living in poverty, they don't have access to good health care, they don't have access to technology, they don't have access to the things that that people with more means have access to. So this virus, I know we haven't talked about it, and this isn't like the focus of this panel, but you have to talk about race and socioeconomics as part of the struggle public schools are going to have across this country, particularly in urban centers. This metro area has a large number of poor children who attend the public schools, and I don't think that is necessarily going to be addressed as people are talking about the virus in general, mostly because the virus itself is so indiscriminate. But there are other factors about, at least where I do my work, that I think will ravish our communities, not just because it is is a health scare and a health challenge, but also because you're talking about populations of people who were already vulnerable before COVID-19 erupted. And now they're more vulnerable than ever because they are more likely to die given the kinds of contexts they live in, work in, and even the school environments where the school buildings sit.
Absolutely, and I think those issues of health equity and that tie into economic equity, and the fact that you have these disadvantaged areas where it is a higher risk for children to spread the disease back to family members. Many of families actually live together with multi-generations, more so than other areas of our state, and a lot of people that are making policy decisions aren't thinking about that. They're not as in tune with those populations. The other piece of it too, that and that's where I'm curious about, both from a public health perspective, as a parental perspective, and obviously as a clinician, the idea of mental health for children too. I mean, I think there's this idea that, oh, well, kids are going to go to school. If they get sick, it's not going to be that serious. People know that they might spread it to older people, but what if they do? Sort of the guilt and responsibility and sort of the mental health issues that may be affecting the students as they go back to school and confront some of these really heavy issues that they've never had to confront before. Curious to get your thoughts on all that.
I'm so happy you mentioned the mental health component of this, because it's real. And even on the other side of it, the social isolation of, when we were sheltering in place, there were a lot of children and adults who were expressing mental health issues. We were concerned about children being abused in homes who may not be going to school, where maybe some of that abuse could be identified and recognized. And so these were real things going on. And now you add on to that, you're correct, this risk of, wow, what if I go to school and bring back this deadly disease to my family? So that's a real thing. And, even as healthcare workers, we worry about that every day. When I come back in my house, I worry, am I bringing in COVID into my home? And so, we take some specific precautions in terms of, making sure I'm not touching anything before I completely, sanitize myself. And this is what's going to happen in schools. We're all basically going to have to start treating children like healthcare workers. If you are on the front lines, if you're an ER doc, you pretty much disrobe and take off everything before you come in the house so that you don't infect your family. You almost go to do a decontamination, before you come in the house. And maybe that's where we're going to have to get with our children, which is pretty scary, but, that's the only way they're going to have to be, as we said before, disciplined. It has to be a disciplined approach to how we manage this. And so if you insist on going to school, these are some of the things that are going to happen, when you come back in your home.
And, Clark, one of the things that I struggled with, of course, as we were closing the end of the school year, were the seniors. They didn't get closure on 12 plus years of schooling. I got to see a lot of kind of the wear and tear of the virus, their fears and concerns, even in something as simple as, or seemingly simple as, what are we going to do about graduation? And I don't think that, I know that school people think about learning and everything else, but, our babies, the kids are social creatures. They miss their friends. This is the social structure that they have been conditioned for years, to go, you leave home, you kind of have one little style, you go to school, you're a little different, but it is the social structure of how we raise our children. And so that was abruptly pulled out from them. And I think that kids, especially young kids and early adolescent children, are the immersion, if you will, in all things, kind of humanity oriented, or sort of, wanting to be with other people and determine sort of who you are as a young person is all part of schooling too. So it's been an abrupt shift for them that is, weighing on them. And I'm not going to digress, but I am going to read you an email from a parent. I did get permission to share the information, mostly because her child is a special needs child. And I just want you to know, or our listeners to know, how people are experiencing this, and families are experiencing it. So she writes to me because she still knows me from my superintendent work. She says, my son has been receiving special ed services. He had already demonstrated that learning online is a complete failure for him. Leading up to COVID-19, my son was failing 5 classes already. When COVID hit, he did some assignments the first 3 weeks, but missed most. For the first 4 weeks, the assignments were just loaded into Google Classroom. There's really no class structure, not enough engagement from teachers. His caseworker and her family members were infected with COVID. Without the structure and engagement, my son let procrastination take over and essentially quit school. He started sleeping 16 to 20 hours a day, refusing to get up. Later, when his teachers and the social workers tried to re-engage him, he had basically quit. His mental health rapidly declined. He became oppositional, defiant, and aggressive. Having school online again this semester, I think, will be another disaster. My son now has issues with initiation, organization, understanding direction, and focus. In order to save my child's mental health, get him learning again, and get him on the rails, I have no other option but to put him in a residential treatment center. I mean, this is what people are experiencing. And I know this parent, this is not a parent who's living in poverty.
The fact that that's even an option for her to put her child in a facility in and of itself is a privilege, and the mental health piece of this.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Right. Everyone's not a teacher. And so providing online virtual classrooms, for some folks, just is not going to work. And there's a mental health issue with that in terms of your self-esteem. Like, maybe that's not the way I learn. And as a parent, well, I can't teach my child that. Maybe I don't even have that academic level myself. And so that's a whole nother set of frustrations as you sit at home and try to teach your child something you don't understand yourself.
Right. And so I think on one hand, there's the educational part that surfaces the disparities. And then on the other hand, for the health part, as Dr. Ford talked about, but there are other luxuries. Like, there's some schools, I think this is a great idea. They're doing the assurance testing. And while it's not perfect, I know people talk about the false negatives and all those sorts of things that can possibly happen. But I was thinking, like, I can't even imagine that a public school district would be able to pull off assurance testing for, in our case, in Atlanta, 52,000 kids. But in DeKalb, where Dr. Ford is, you're doubling that number in the public school system. So it's not just surfacing in like these educational opportunities or lack thereof for families, but it's also surfacing in the health environment as well. Because if you're going to a private school, they're doing that. They're doing assurance testing. They have ways to create at least more support for families as part of their strategy. I don't see where that's possible in public environments.
And I think it's a lot of these disparities in just capabilities that different systems and different schools have that are just coming to the forefront right now in a big way. You know, you're talking about the infamous class of 2020. My middle son was a senior this year, and it was a very different senior spring for him. And, you know, of course, for us, it's like, well, it was a bummer. He didn't have, you know, prom or graduation and walk across although we're going to do this bizarre distance kind of graduation this Friday, actually, tomorrow, for the international school. But you realize, though, very quickly with teenagers in particular is how important the social education is for forming, forming their brains as they grow. And I you know, when we look at the virtual learning environment and the fact that all of a sudden you're either in class or you're not, right? Then it sort of defines a lot of the social interactions and the learning that happens as these young people become the adults that they need to be. Only some of that is actually done in the classroom. So I'm curious. I mean, we sort of talked a bit about the virtual learning. Obviously, virtual learning isn't an option for all school systems. We're doing a pilot program with UP3 in the KIPP schools to try to help them figure out. I mean, how do they deal with a situation where those kids can't? You know, they're not going home and hopping online with mobile devices that are readily available, and they're certainly not going to their lake house or mountain home and doing remote schooling from there, as some are. So I guess what do you guys think are the things that, as we shift into a situation where we are having to do some distance learning or some virtual learning, what lessons have we learned over this, you know, semester that we need to take into this future semester? How do we make it even tenable at all for students to allow them to continue learning but still be safe?
So, Clark, for me, I think that I think you talked a little bit about it just now, but I think the technology, more so the connectivity, is a big issue. I mean, Frederick Douglass said that, you know, equal rights and the equal means to maintain them is basically, you know, the what undergirds like all the rights for all people to be able to prosper in our country. And I think that the connectivity issue tied to education is as problematic as voting rights was in the 1860s and the 1960s and the Clean Water Act of the 1970s. It is the new civil right. I believe that without connectivity, you are literally making it impossible for especially poor people to have access to jobs so they can, you know, stabilize their families, and also for students to have access to teleschooling. And I think that, you know, the device part is absolutely fair. You know, devices are sort of like the textbooks of the new. You know, every kid should get a textbook if, you know, back when I was in school. And today, schools should provide the actual device to kids. But it's the connectivity piece that I think is like water or electricity. It should never be turned off in an emergency. And whether it's a bad tornado or a virus, people should have access to information, and they should have access to the ways to be able to maintain, if you will, their right to connectivity. And I think that it's as important as voting, as, you know, equal protections under the law, being able to not be enslaved. I mean, you name a right. I think that connectivity for the 21st century is the issue, the biggest issue we're going to have to wrestle to the ground, because you cannot convince me in the COVID-19 virus, if you're not able to find every kid by seeing them connect every day for school, that they're learning at all. And the parent whose email I read to you, I think is a perfect case in point. I mean, she can't get her kid to get connected. That's just one part. Imagine the child who doesn't have the fully engaged parent, the parent who doesn't have any access to resources, and also cannot pay for all of the charges related to connectivity. And I would stretch it one step further and say that's true for educators as well. We're telling educators to use their own technology, their connectivity. You can use your district laptop, but you have to use your own connectivity, no compensation for that, and still try to teach using the platforms we have to use and be available every day to do it without even having a strategy to ensure that they all can be connected without any issues in their homes. So I think the connectivity piece is the canary in the coal mine. Without us doing it, I think we're playing on the fringes as it relates to education this fall, and until we find something that addresses the virus itself with some kind of cure.
So on that point, so Dr. Ford, I was curious about, because there's this weird tension, right, in the sense that we do need connectivity so that we can do some virtual learning. At the same time, I think everybody realizes or seems to suggest that virtual learning is not as good as in-person learning, which then suggests that we need to do in-person learning, but how do we do it safely? I mean, what do you recommend as the school systems that are trying to figure that out? How do they wrestle with those health consequences? What really do they need to do in order to make that safe? And can it be safe to have that in-person, kind of learning environment until we can deal with some of these connectivity issues to at least maybe have a hybrid? What are your thoughts?
Right. I agree that connectivity is a critical issue, but I think that, as a pediatrician, I'm thinking about our younger kids, 6th grade and below. Visual cues and face-to-face is such a critical part of learning. And I think that you cannot duplicate that online. And so whatever we're doing right now, even in this virtual realm, has got to be a temporary solution. This cannot be a long-term solution. And so, hopefully we can get this pandemic contained enough that we can resume regular learning structure. In the meantime, we've got to be firm about regulating mask wear for everyone who set foot in school. This cannot be an optional decision. We've got to make sure that, our kids understand. And this is going to be a real challenge for our younger children because, again, that social piece of them just is compelled to touch each other all the time. And that's going to have to be, especially if you've been isolated since March, you've not seen your friends, your first instinct is to put your hands on them. And so that's going to be very hard to condition children to not do that. It's in their nature to be physical. And it provides emotional well-being to do that. And so it's going to be a real challenge to discourage that. And so that whole training has to take place. But from the sanitation piece, again, we go back to privilege because, I remember getting that list of supplies when my son was in younger grades. These is what I needed. Hand sanitizer and wipes were always on the list, even then. Now it's probably going to be tenfold. And can you even find them? I haven't seen wipes in a grocery store in months. So how is that going to play itself out for those school districts that don't have access to supplies? But that somebody's going to have to figure out how to get these surfaces cleaned in between classes. Wipe that desk down, wipe that seat down. How do we deal with doorknobs, restrooms? Which on a good day are a challenge. All these types of things, school buses, and so I think that the optimal way to manage this is really to Dr. Carstarphen's point, there are some children that really, really, really need to be in school. And then there's some kids that can probably be okay at home. And it needs to be thoughtful, the decisions about who needs to sit in a classroom and who doesn't. And that's a tough decision that's going to have to be made on a number of different levels based on special needs, based on maybe even your economic issues. I have to go to work. This child has to be in school. But for folks who really, really don't need to be in school, they should probably be taking classes virtually if that's an option. And it's going to have to be some type of hybrid based on that. I mean, I can talk about health, but as you just said, health and economics are tied. And so if the doctor in me says everybody stay home, I get that that's not an option. And so let's try to be thoughtful about who gets to go to school and who can probably do better in a virtual world.
And it sounds like the price for that, it sounds like the price for that going back to school, of engaging with people and teachers in person, is wearing a mask, right? So but you can't have I agree, you can't have it because some people don't wear it, and it minimizes the effectiveness of the others who do it. So it's very complicated. And I think obviously we're talking about school here. I think businesses and work are dealing with very similar things because you sort of, when people do come back, it can't just be optional because if one person doesn't have it on, then it really does cause a problem. The other point that I love that got brought up a little earlier is just the virtual learning is great. I mean, certainly we do it a lot better now than we would have done it 5 years ago. But just to point out for some of our viewers today, right now, we can see Dr. Carstarphen on the phone, but she can't see us. And so, I mean, even as good as you are, Meria, right? It's been hard here because I can see you can't see us, and so there have been times where Dr. Ford is about to say something, and I know you can't see us, so it's hard. It makes it hard to interact. It's not completely natural. If we were on a stage somewhere, this would have been a lot more natural just because it just is. And I think, certainly things that we're learning to work better together, but we've got a long way to go. So another question
I just want to say that part of, and I don't think the listening audience knows, but I mean, just to be able to participate in this, I think we probably put 5 hours in trying to get all the technologies to work. And that was just me. That wasn't even the other people on the panel and all the check-ins. So imagine a teacher or a parent who is not able to do the multitasking that we were doing to be able to put this panel together. There were 3 people behind the scenes that no one will ever know who were trying to troubleshoot all the problems we were running into. I can't imagine that a parent or a teacher who is trying to manage, even virtually, a class of 23, 27 kids can do that flawlessly. And there just isn't enough time in the day. When it works, it's great. When it doesn't, there's a lot of learning that is not going to happen. And I will say, I think at the heart, back to kind of the anchor of why we're having this panel, I think at the heart of why there are school districts that are going all virtual, at the heart of it is the fact that there are no uniform safety guidelines that they believe people will even follow. And I also think there is hesitation to want to issue consequences or discipline if people don't do it. And that to me is why there's virtual learning. It's not because anybody's pointing to real facts about kids will learn better or this age group will be enhanced and this one we can support in a different way. This is, I think, because no one can figure out the health and safety standards and guidelines and then do the next step required to enforce them. And without those two things, I think a lot of schools will still be in the virtual learning space, which isn't good for all kids for the reasons Dr. Ford mentioned, and I could name a bunch of others that I did before about some of the disenfranchised student groups. But if we don't get serious about the science and the ways that kids and educators or anybody who works in that school or comes on that campus is expected to behave, whether that's wearing a mask or the hygiene on the hands or social distancing and everything else that's in the list, I think that we're going to be going back and forth with problems related to connectivity, socioeconomics, and race, and everything else that we've kind of hit on in this conversation. So getting disciplined about the discipline of uniform safety guidelines is essential.
what should be happening right now in school districts that are 100% virtual is that they should be planning all these different types of things in anticipation of going back to in face-to-face in the next semester. And so we can't take this time, and that's going to be a challenge, because while these teachers are teaching virtually, somebody else has to be sitting in the background going, okay, how do we make this work when we need to be back? And all those things about safety, about transportation, about food, about distancing, about masks, about cleanliness are still having to be thought of in the background while we continue to try to teach these children.
Absolutely. And so you talk about planning. One of the things we haven't talked about quite as much today is the fact that, so we do have some schools that are going back, but we've started seeing schools that are going back, then they're having, because it looks like a lack of discipline, you know, there aren't necessarily, the schools either don't feel comfortable doing it or feel like they shouldn't do it, or for whatever reason, they're not enforcing those safety guidelines. And then we're seeing outbreaks. And then all of a sudden they're sending everybody home, or large groups of people home. What do we need to be doing as parents to plan for a situation where maybe, you know, some segment of our school that might include our children do get sent back home after going to school? Now all of a sudden you might have planned for them to be back in school, and then one day you say, oh, nope, actually they're coming back, and they're going to have to distance learn for the next week. What kind of preparation or planning should parents make for that? Or, I mean, can we really? I mean, if it's there's such uncertainty. Dr. Ford, what should we be thinking about or doing to sort of prepare for that kind of back and forth in our homes?
I mean, to me, that's really the worst case scenario, because if you've already told your employer, I'm heading back to work, my child's in school, and then the school shuts down, you know, then now you've got to go back and explain that to your boss. And so, you know, I'm not sure that anyone plans for that. It's almost like when we have bad weather days, you know, and you still have to go to work, and now your school is closed. How do you operate that? I think that parents should be prepared, as always, with some kind of backup person, but that's not always an option. And so I worry about that. I worry that when these schools unexpectedly have to shut down, there's going to be a lot of children at home unsupervised because their parents simply have no other option but to continue to go to work.
Hey, Clark, I have a couple of ideas that I think parents absolutely have to be prepared to do. And they started tapping into it when the virus first broke, but there are things that I do think we can do even if things aren't perfect, like establishing a healthy routine. I was delivering food with our food nutrition workers, safety and security staff, and a bunch of volunteers and bus drivers as we were finishing out the school year. And nothing would upset me more than going to those bus stops and stopping in front of homes and the kids coming out at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock in the day, and they were still in their pajamas, or, you know, they were just waking up. And I don't think that you have to be wealthy or particularly, you know, have the perfect household or connectivity, but I do think you can establish a routine. Like, everybody does still have to get up at 7:30 in the morning if that's the time. There should be, I don't care how small the apartment is, a place that is for learning. It is not for eating. It is not for playing games. It is for the designated area, even if you have to go sit on the outside stoop. If that is the spot where you're going to do it, then that's where the discipline on setting aside some time for learning has to be, because it is going to be a bunch of rolling closures. And I think parents can do that. I also think that our families are letting the little ones sometimes run the household. In other words, they're not turning off the monitor time, especially with gaming. I have been, people will call me, put me on FaceTime, walk me through their homes. You know, this is what happens when you've been the superintendent and everybody has your cell phone number, but it's okay. Please keep calling. I'm happy to help. But like, they will walk me through their home and they're like, how do I set this up? But it must be set up. and there has to be a routine. And school is starting school soon. I mean, some schools have already started, especially charter schools and some private schools, but other systems are coming back, you know, by the end of this month. And so you have to get back into the discipline of having a learning space in the home. In case your school closes or you have to they're sending everyone back again. And I think the last part is around the social, emotional, and academic development of the child. Just making sure that you have that schedule, even if it's get up, you're going to have a little bit of breakfast. Now you have to sit down and read. Now you have to do X, Y, and Z. And this is the time you can go outside and play a little bit, but you have to come back inside and do your work. I do think our families can do that. I really do. And I also think corporate and philanthropy can help our families. I've seen people establishing what they're calling micro schools. You know, there are pros and cons to all that stuff. But if necessary, I would take a page out of the book of how people are trying to do smaller schooling environments. If one person in the neighborhood, you know, really has to go to work or in an apartment building, are there people who can stay with small numbers of kids, social distance them, and keep them on a schedule? I think this is time for like a community, might be a micro community, but micro community support as well. So it right. is a stinker, hands down. I feel like we're all the way back to March 13th in the school situation. And I have seen those pictures, and it is so upsetting to me to see kids in pool parties and sleepovers, and then now to see them jammed up in hallways without masks on. I mean, it's just not smart. And so I know families can do better and make better decisions. I think we should expect them to. So
Dr. Ford, if some of these kids do come back, you know, one of the things that, like, it's a great point, Meria, with this idea of you got to create discipline within scheduling, you know, with kids back home. But what if there's you have these boomerang kids now that have gone to school, and because of the threat of an outbreak, they've now been sent home. Well, now they might actually be infected. I mean, how do we as parents, especially in those areas, how do we then handle these children that may be infected or may be carriers when we're uncertain if they are or not, and how they interact with us, with grandparents or others they may come in contact with? What are the safe kind of protocols that we should implement with children that may have been infected?
Well, the first line of defense is to get them tested. You know, we have pretty much widespread availability of tests these days, and we have even swabbed infants for COVID-19. So there is no minimum age. And if, you know, I'm all about knowledge is power. So knowing whether or not you're infected is first and foremost. And the other challenge is once you've been identified as, you know, having been infected, where do you go in your household? How do you socially isolate? How do you stay away from your family members? What if there's only one bathroom in your house? And so for issues like that, it's going to have to be just a much more meticulous. It's almost going to be like the classroom. If this person uses the restroom, it has to be sanitized after they leave. And that's tough when you've been living in the same household, you know, for all this time. But, you know, that those 10 to 14 days that you're being isolated, you know, you have to make sure that you're protecting the other members of your family. And so if that means kind of staying away from everybody, if you have the ability to sleep in a separate room, do so. And other folks may just have to bunk up together for a while this individual is recovering, just to protect themselves. That's a scary, it's a scary
Absolutely.
Thought. So I was worried about.
It really is. It really is. So with the last 5 minutes, I mean, you bring up testing, and that was actually kind of what I wanted to end on. So that's perfect. You know, when we think about testing and the availability of testing, I think there's still a lot of mystery around testing, and how quickly you get results back and all of that. What do we need to be doing for testing as families? And then Meria, what do you think we should be doing about testing in the school environment as well? And handling that. I mean, Dr. Ford, what do we need to do to make sure that we are using the testing that's available to its greatest efficacy?
You know, and that's a great question, because I want to say that we've gotten a number of requests from, for example, businesses that want to come and be tested every week. We've gotten a couple of athletic teams that want to come in and get weekly COVID tests. First of all, that's a terrible use of resources, A. B, it doesn't tell you anything, because a negative test today is a negative test today. It does not mean you won't go right out and get exposed and infected from a different source. And so testing is just one method of just for sure confirming whether or not you have the disease. But in the meantime, the same precautions still need to take place. You know, you still need to mask up. You still need to wash your hands. You need to be mindful of what you touch, because I don't believe that we're going to necessarily test our way out of this pandemic, because, as you mentioned, there are different types of tests. There are delays with testing depending on which lab you use. It can be anywhere from 24 hours to 12 days to get your results back. And so by the time you get your results back, you've probably already completed your entire quarantine or isolation period. So, you know, until we have some standardized tests that are, you know, more reliable and more consistent, that's going to continue to be a challenge. And so we are really telling everyone to act as if everyone has COVID. And that way you can make sure that you protect, you stay away from them, you wear your mask, you wash your hands, you know. It's like we say during flu season, we just assume everyone has the flu. And that way you can decrease your risk. When both parties wear a mask, you can decrease your risk of contracting COVID by as much as 80%. That's huge. That's huge. And I think that if I'm a parent and I want my child to go to school, that's going to be my expectation, is that not only my child is wearing his mask, but that everyone around him is wearing their mask as well. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Meria, anything to add to that?
I'd just say that there were a lot of things that we learned when we were doing food distribution, working with the adults. And, you know, and it started off when we didn't know very much about the virus, where frontline workers were simply expected to wear gloves. We weren't even wearing masks then. I remember the day as a leader, even without having any agreement at the federal, state, and local level from elected leadership, we just made an independent decision to have all of our frontline workers wear masks. And it was mostly because of the controversy that it was clear to me that we needed to err on the side of caution, even though we really weren't the experts like Dr. Ford and others. But she knows I would call her all the time and torture her all night long with these kinds of questions. And I think that it paid off, because schools have a lot of routines. I mean, that's part of what I think parents depend on when they can't quite reach their own child or get them, you know, fully where they want them to be. Often a coach or a teacher or a counselor or a principal, you know, will step in, or even a peer to help redirect that young person. And so the structures inside of school, and I'll just talk you through a simple one. What is expected the moment you get on a school bus? And we require that kids sit down in a school bus. I know that sounds crazy, but we have to say you have to put the bottom of yourself on the top of a seat. And so they're just like things that kids know in school. You know, I may not do it at home, but school might make me. And I have to do it because that's just how it works. And I think a lot of that can be done. So in addition to sitting down in a school bus or putting on a seatbelt in a car or walking into a school, especially at the secondary level, we do safety and security checks. They dig through every kid's backpack for guns and knives or anything that would break a school code. We do that every morning. So why wouldn't we, for example, do something like we did with the frontline workers? I think taking temperatures, and if it's over the scientific allowance, we send kids home. We do a little bit of proactive work, not just the masks and using the hand sanitizers and things of the sort, but kind of like stopping it at the door with the temperature checks. And I think, again, a luxury, and probably, like Dr. Ford said, not a perfect solution. But some of this assurance testing, especially for kids or families who can define why they are concerned or they feel like they might need to have testing more than others, given their life circumstance. is something that we should consider. But for what it's worth, I think there are some existing protocols in schools that would allow us to be have those disciplinary behaviors in place for both the adults and the children. And it can start the moment they put a foot on the step to get in the bus or walk through the door of the school.
Well, it sounds like the big word for the day is discipline. Discipline based on knowledge. So Dr. Carstarphen, Dr. Ford, thank you so much for your leadership during this crazy time. We're so grateful to have folks like you that not only know what we should be doing and are thinking about that all the time, but also are just so eloquent at expressing it and helping us realize the way forward and what we should be doing. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank all of you who were able to join us. Hope that your families are staying safe and clean through this crisis. But also ask that if at some point you feel like they're not safe, or if you are experiencing mental health difficulties, reach out to people who can help. There's a lot of resources out there for folks. And please take advantage of those. It's a tough time for everyone. So stay safe, and we look forward to hopefully a successful fall season of learning, and a lot of kids learning a lot of stuff, but doing so in a safe fashion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Clark. Thank you, Marina.
Thanks so much. Great to see everyone.